What going on, fam? I got some more history for y'all, boy, that's gonna blow your fucking mind. Proving that the so-called Negroes indigenous to America and we didn't get off no slave ships. So let's jump right to it. The first piece of evidence I want to share with y'all comes from the voyages of Giovanni de Verrazzano, who made contact with indigenous Americans in 1524, and this is how he described them in his book. They go completely naked except that around their loins they wear the skins of small animals like the martens, with a narrow belt of grass around the body, to which they tie the various tails of other animals which hang down to their knees. The rest of the body is bare and so is the head. Some of them wear garlands of bird feathers. They are dark in color, not unlike the Ethiopians, with thick black hair, not very long, tied back behind the head like a small tail. As for the physique of these men, they are very well proportioned, of medium height, and a little taller than we are. Verrazzano is clearly stating that he encountered indigenous Negroes upon entering the east coast of America. The tribe that Verrazzano encountered was most likely of the Carib race, as the Carib race of indigenous Americans had dominated the east coast of North America, a portion of Central America, and a portion of South America by this time. Also notice that he points out that these people wore feathers in their head, which is synonymous with American history. So from there, let's discuss the identity of the Carib race of the American negroid. The Carib are descended from the Lemuria and negroid, aka the pygmies are the little people, which are the first physical humans on Earth and can be identified as the Negrito and Negrillo populations of today. The Tasmanians are a great representation of the Lemurian, as they are mentioned several times in esoteric works. The Carib race are the children of the American pygmy and are represented esoterically as the Atlanteans and biblically as the Cushites. The Carib were the invaders, conquering and assimilating the pygmy tribes of the Americas in prehistoric times. This same Carib race eventually conquered and spread through portions of Africa, assimilating with the indigenous groups there. Let's check out this article in the St. Louis Medical Review in 1911, written by Albert S. Ashmead, MD, detailing his research on the human as a geological species, and specifically the American Negroid and the American Mongoloid. This is a very long piece of work, so I will just be highlighting certain areas. However, I encourage you all to read this in its entirety. The first portion I want to read from you comes from part 2, and it goes as follows. Various isolated but concordant facts permit the supposition that long before the possession of Middle America by and formation and development of the great ethnographic groups, the Paris, the Caribs, and the Andeans, a great part of the South American continent had been occupied by an inferior race of the Negroid type. Many of these traditions of the Darien recount that when their ancestors first arrived in most remote time, they found the territory occupied by little black men. Let's stop there and examine this passage. The little black men that Ashmead is describing is the pygmy, which I already explained is the first, or prime, or primitive Negroid that manifested all across the earth. This passage is simply stating that there's evidence that the pygmy also lived in the Americas, which is also backed by the discovery of Lucia. Ashmead clearly states that a Negroid of inferior type had dominated a large portion of South America. Let's keep going. Those tribes of Caribs who arrived in Panama and Central America coming in contact with the local, advanced, supposed to be Negro civilization became part of the Nahuas. This is yet another passage describing the ancient American as being Negro. From there, we take a trip to page 354, third paragraph from the top, and it reads, primitive man in most ancient America, long before the civilization pre-Incan of the coast began, is supposed to have been a dwarf, as he, like the dwarf races of Atlas and the Pyrenees and everywhere else on earth for that matter, was a worshiper of the constellation Pleiades and the moon. This passage is another reference to the dwarf race or the pygmies, or the little black men that we spoke about in part 2. Then on page 355, he states, for the earliest man of Panama and the Darien was a Negroid, just as the Otomies of Mexico were. Notice how he says the Otomies of Mexico were, because he understands that through reclassification, the Otomies of Mexico are no longer Negroid. They have been replaced with an Asiatic. Then on page 356, Tumaco is a beautiful port close to Ecuador and Colombia and was also the name of a cacique of Darien, and Darien was inhabited by Negro races in long past time. Then further down on the same page, there were many tribes of Indians at the time of the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, who are thought by scientists to belong to a Negro race. Such were the Otomies of Mexico, the Caracals of Haiti, so on and so forth. On page 357, he states, Gomer speaks of the Negro slaves who were held on Panama soil. The Negro figure with frequency in most remote traditions of Peru and other American peoples. These men were little and black and lived in groves and woods. Again, he's talking about the indigenous American pygmy. The same thing is seen in ancient Mexican sculpture related to a period anterior to that of the Otomis, such as the great diacritic head of the Hyopan and the great hatchet of Veracruz, whose head presents a great similarity with the figure of the woman of the statue of San Augustine. Both have identical features and are of the same style and obedient to the same model, that of the indigenous Negro race, whose dispersed remains were encountered by the conquerors and upon which was founded later the so-called American Red Race. New facts and discoveries will doubtless confirm this supposition that the primitive American population was a negroid race. I'll read that again. New facts and discoveries will doubtless confirm this supposition that the primitive American population was a negroid race. You got that? We know only today the culture states of about 3 groups of the most ancient man in America. The Pampean races of Argentina and the Atlantic coast, which are the firstborn after the Lemurians. The Carib, the cruel navigating invaders from the West Indies of a later time long after the original man had come by some other land route, probably uniting as is thought the Cape of Good Hope with Cape Horn. That's the ancient super landmass known as Lemuria that connected ancient Africa with ancient America. There were Negroes surely who had brought from Madagascar the sweet potato vine and the taro plant to the oceanic islands of the Pacific and to the negrotic races of the Papa, who had also brought the banana plant. That's evident by saying we know that the sweet potato plant is indigenous to America, but it can be found in the oceanic islands in Madagascar. Thirdly, we have the great Andean races, the mountain tribes, dwellers of the heights of 12,000 and 16,000 feet above sea level. All these 3 separate types of races of ancient man and South American continent were amalgamated with the original Hamite dwarf, who was our most primitive American being. They're telling you that all of these 3 ancient Negroid races of America somewhat descended or assimilated with the ancient pygmy that lived in America. Some other authors, since the analysis of the problem as to the origin of the American population was commenced, have even thought that the Caribs of the Antilles had descended from the remains of a population which had survived the submersion and the destruction of the legendary Atlantis. And let me start right there to reiterate that the ancient Lemurians are the Hamites and the ancient Atlanteans are the Cushites, their descendants. Even Ashme considered the fact that the more advanced Carib Negroes were descended from Atlantis. Now, I know a lot of y'all don't believe in Atlantis, calling it a lost continent, but it actually ain't a lost continent, it's a lost tribe. Atlantis was never an individual continent, but it was an offshoot of Lemuria. Lemuria is the biblical Ham and is known esoterically as Shamali, the moon worshippers. And the Atlanteans in the Bible are known as Cushites. In the Bible, Cush is the son of Ham and the father of the lost tribes of Atlantis. The esoteric writings of Arthur E. Powell in his book called The Solar System states the third root race, the Lemurian race, occupied the continent of Lemuria, or Shamali as it is called in ancient story. Roughly speaking, this was a large Pacific continent in the South Sea. The race is the negroid, and some of its descendants still exist, though by this time much mixed with the offshoots of later races. He goes on to state the fourth root race, the Atlantean race inhabited the continent of Atlantis, or Kush, most of which has now disappeared under the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the present inhabitants of Earth today belong to this race. The only thing I disagree with Powell on in this passage is that Atlantis didn't sink, but yet it broke apart, forming the continents of South America and Africa and creating the Atlantic Ocean, or the Ethiopian Sea as it was called back then, because all Negroids were considered to be Ethiopian at this time. The Carib and the Antilles and other islands were survivors of that cataclysm that destroyed Lemuria, or Atlantis, and considered themselves to be born from the volcano that caused the destruction. Quick summary. This video just showed the origin of the indigenous American races, how the first race was the Pygmy or the Lemurian, the original Earthling, and the 3 more advanced American Negro races, the Plains Indian or the Pampean, the Carib Negro, which were the invaders that make up the bulk of the so-called Black American population through conquering and assimilating tribes here as well as Africa, as we know that the Carib race also invaded through Western Africa and Oceania, which is evident through the sweet potato plant and the taro root, and the last race is the Andean Negroid, or the mountain people. Also remember that during the time of Lemuria, Africa, America, and Oceania was all connected. This is evident through rock formations and ancient maps such as the Perry Reach map of 1513, which shows South America and Africa connected through the Antarctic landmass which surrounds the Earth. This supercontinent only broke apart 60,000 years ago. The destruction of the supercontinent lasted tens of thousands of years, up until 12,000 years ago, in a period known as the Younger Dryas. This is also the period of time when the other two anatomically modern human races were born onto the planet Earth. Those two races are the Tartarian Mongoloid, which is your biblical Semite, and the Aryan, which is your biblical Gentile, or Yaphetic. The two new races also brought disease to the old world, as the melting of the ice unleashed viruses that spread to animals, and then to the two new races through the domestication of animals and the consumption of their meat, and also sharing their living quarters with these animals. This is the origin of most communicable diseases. That is why Caucasian and Mongol contact with indigenous people spread disease to those indigenous groups. Even most sexually transmitted diseases have their origin with animals. The earlier negroid races were primarily vegetarian and did not domesticate with animals. That's it for today's video. Make sure y'all hit that like and that follow button for some more controversial historical content. And if you're ever in the low country, make sure y'all check out Gumbo's Juicy Takeout, 3875 Burns Drive in St. Stephen, South Carolina. Peace out, homies.